Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt and transformative tales that resonate with the human experience. Today's story is one of unexpected discoveries, deep revelations, and the power of family. Ethan Carter, a successful but emotionally distant CEO, finds his world turned upside down when he uncovers a family secret that has been hidden for decades. As he navigates the complexities of his newfound role as a father figure, Ethan learns profound lessons about love, grief, and second chances. Stay with us as we dive into this emotional journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story with Life Stories. Ethan Carter wasn't one for making time for such things. After all, his life was consumed with board meetings, corporate strategies, and endless emails. The retirement home, nestled on the outskirts of the city, was only a short 20-minute drive from his office. But it might as well have been on another continent. It had been almost a year since he last visited his father, Henry, a man who had always been more of an intimidating presence than a loving parent. The last visit had been forced, an obligatory holiday drop-in, which ended with awkward silence and a stiff, uncomfortable walk to the elevator. He hadn't felt the need to return since. Ethan's relationship with his father had always been strained. Henry Carter, a man of rigid discipline and unyielding silence, had built his life on structure and order. But he'd never quite built a relationship with his children. Ethan, in particular, had spent most of his life trying to avoid becoming like him. But now, as the years passed and the weight of responsibility grew, Ethan found himself staring in the mirror and noticing the same lines around his mouth, the same stiff posture, and the same silence that plagued him in moments of emotion. He had inherited his father's traits, whether he liked it or not. As he signed in at the front desk of the retirement home, the sterile warmth of the lobby hit him: beige furniture, a piano no one played, and the unmistakable smell of lavender mixed with overcooked carrots. He pulled out his phone, about to check a few emails when a small voice caught him off guard. "Hey, sir, you here to see your grandpa too?" Ethan blinked, startled by the interruption. He looked down to see a little boy standing beside him, holding a juice box in one hand and a bag of pretzels in the other. His hair was wild, his shirt half untucked, and his eyes were wide with curiosity. "Not exactly," Ethan said with a half smile, still trying to process what had just happened. "I'm here to see my dad." The boy tilted his head, seemingly deep in thought, before speaking again. "Mine's not here, just my grandpa. He's in room 407. Ethan's mouth went dry. 407. The number didn't register at first. But then it hit him like a lightning bolt. His father's room number. Room 407. It wasn't just a number. It was etched in his memory. A number he had committed to memory not out of affection, but out of necessity. It was the room number he'd seen every time he visited. And now here was this boy, speaking it with such certainty. "You sure about that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. The boy grinned and nodded. "Yep, 407. I remember because it's the same as my locker at school." But flipped. He took a loud sip of his juice, as if the matter was already settled in his mind. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach, an unsettling feeling he couldn't quite place. He forced a laugh, trying to sound casual, though the words stuck in his throat. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps the boy had gotten the number wrong? Or maybe his father had a new roommate? But something about the boy's grin, the certainty in his voice, unsettled him. Before he could ask anything else, the boy scampered off, waving his hand as he skipped down the hallway toward the residential wing. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, watching him go. Something was off. He couldn't explain it, but something in the air felt different. Ethan followed, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the soft squeak of the boy's sneakers echoing in the otherwise quiet corridor. He turned the corner just as the boy reached the door to room 407. Without knocking, the child opened the door and launched himself inside. The door swinging wide, a woman's voice called out to him, playful and affectionate. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Then, as if in slow motion, the woman appeared, cradling the boy in her arms. her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was in her 30s, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, looking nothing like anyone Ethan had ever seen before. But it wasn't the woman that made Ethan freeze, it was the sight of his father sitting in the recliner, looking up with a smile that Ethan had never seen before. Henry, his father, smiled, really smiled. Ethan's father, who had always been so distant, so stern, was now smiling warmly, standing to greet the woman and placing a hand on the boy's head. A strange wave of emotion washed over Ethan, one he didn't know how to name. His father, his strict, cold father, was laughing, hugging the woman, holding the boy like they were family. The scene was foreign to him. He stood there, just out of sight, his heart racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The warmth in his father's eyes was unmistakable. Ethan had never seen his father like this. He couldn't hear the exact words they exchanged, but the tone, the familiarity, the affection, it was enough. Ethan stood there for a long moment, motionless, before his mind began to race, trying to assemble a timeline that didn't make sense. His father had never mentioned a daughter, let alone a grandchild. There had been no mention of any family beyond his siblings, Jake and Alice. Nothing. So how was it possible that his father, the man who had always been so emotionally distant, was now embracing this woman, calling her by name, holding this boy in his arms like a proud grandparent? He could have gone inside. He could have knocked, demanded answers, but not today, not yet, not when everything he thought he knew about his father was shattering before him. Instead, Ethan turned and walked out, his boots heavy on the tile, his mind spinning. Outside, the cold wind hit him in the face, and he stood there, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his car, trying to breathe. Claire, that was the name the boy had said. He replayed the words in his mind, like a reel stuck in an endless loop. His father had a secret, and now, it was impossible to ignore. The drive back to his office felt longer than usual, the cold wind biting at his skin as Ethan sat in his car, the engine running, his thoughts a whirlwind. His father had a secret he had kept for over 30 years, hidden in plain sight. It was as though the world had shifted beneath his feet, and Ethan was now standing in a place he couldn't quite comprehend. The boy had said his grandpa was in room 407. But it wasn't just that. It was the look on his father's face, the warmth, the tenderness, that caught him off guard. It wasn't the man he had known. Henry Carter, the man who had never shown affection, never offered warmth, was now a stranger to him. Ethan had always felt the distance between himself and his father. Their relationship had been cold, transactional at best. It wasn't that Henry hadn't provided. He had given Ethan everything he needed, a roof over his head, a comfortable life, but no affection, no encouragement, no real connection. It was as though Henry had been more concerned with duty than love. Ethan had spent his entire life trying to avoid becoming like him, trying to break free from the suffocating expectations that had shaped him. And yet, here he was, confronted with the truth about his father's secret life. By the time Ethan pulled into the parking lot of his office, he had made up his mind. He had to confront his father. This wasn't something that could be ignored. It was too big, too important. For years, he had tried to understand his father's coldness, chalking it up to the man's own upbringing, his grief, his unspoken emotions. But now, Ethan realized, there was more to the story. His father wasn't just emotionally unavailable, he had been hiding a piece of his past, a piece of his heart, from the world, from his family. The following day, Ethan walked into the retirement home with determination in his step. He had already scheduled a meeting with his father. This time, there would be no detours, no excuses. He was going to get answers. When he signed in at the front desk, the receptionist smiled politely, but Ethan barely acknowledged her. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the conversation he was about to have. Room 407. The number haunted him. It wasn't just a number anymore. It was a door to a life he hadn't known existed. When he knocked on the door, Henry looked up, surprised but not entirely displeased. Ethan didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the door open and walked in, shutting it behind him. His father was sitting in a recliner, a crossword puzzle on his lap. He looked thinner than before, frail in a way that made Ethan's heart tighten. But his eyes, those eyes, were different. They weren't the cold, distant eyes Ethan had always known. They were softer, warmer. The man sitting in front of him was a stranger. And yet, not Ethan, his father said, setting the crossword aside. I didn't expect you back so soon. Ethan didn't beat around the bush. He needed answers, and he needed them now. We need to talk, he said, his voice tight with emotion. Henry's expression faltered, but he nodded slowly, folding the paper and setting it aside. There was an understanding between them. Unspoken yet clear. Ethan took a step forward, arms crossed, his jaw tight. I saw her, he said, voice cracking slightly. Henry didn't react immediately. He just rubbed his temple, his eyes flickering with something Ethan couldn't quite decipher. Lily, Ethan continued, and the boy, Noah. She called you, Dad. You hugged her, kissed your grandson on the head. So how long has this been going on? Henry leaned back in his chair, his breath shallow. A long time, he replied quietly. Ethan waited, but his father said nothing more. You want to be a little more specific than that? Ethan asked, his frustration rising. How long? How long have you kept this from me? From all of us? Henry looked toward the window, his gaze distant, as if you were searching for something in the past. Lily was born the year after your mother passed, he said, his voice a whisper, almost like he was speaking to himself. Ethan's heart stopped. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. You had an affair, Ethan breathed, while we were still picking out her headstone? No, Henry replied, shaking his head. It was after, but not long after. He paused. I didn't know how to tell you. To tell any of you. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. For years, he had believed the loss of his mother had been the defining moment for his family. He had assumed that Henry's coldness, his distance, was a result of grief, of trying to hold the family together. But now, he realized it wasn't just grief. It was a secret, a family that had been kept in the dark for decades. You kept it a secret for what? 35 years? Ethan demanded. And you think that's okay? You think that's the right thing to do? Henry's voice lowered, his gaze dropping to the floor. I did what I thought was best, he said quietly. I supported her privately, quietly. I thought it was the right thing to do. Ethan's mind was racing. You thought the right thing was to keep your daughter hidden like some secret project? Does she know we exist? Henry hesitated, then nodded. Yes, she knows. But she never pushed. She respected the boundaries. He paused again, his voice thick with regret. I never wanted to hurt any of you. I thought it was better this way. Ethan was shaking with disbelief. You had another kid, a daughter, and you just kept her tucked away. While the rest of us sat around wondering why our father couldn't be bothered to show up to half our lives? His voice cracked with emotion, anger and betrayal flooding his chest. I didn't know how to raise you three on my own, Henry said, his voice small. I was angry, grieving. I didn't have it in me back then. With Lily, it was different. I let myself be different. You didn't let us see that version of you. Ethan shot back, his voice filled with pain. Not once. Henry didn't respond for a long time. And when he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. She softened me. Ethan stood there, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He couldn't wrap his head around it. His father had kept this secret for so long. And now it was all coming to light. The truth was raw, uncomfortable, and yet, it was undeniable. I didn't want to hurt you, Henry repeated, but Ethan couldn't find it in himself to forgive. And just like that, everything Ethan thought he knew about his family, about his father, had crumbled. The days that followed were filled with noise and confusion, each passing moment bringing with it a new weight to carry. Ethan found himself unable to stop thinking about the revelation with his father. But the truth wasn't just painful because of what had been hidden. It was because of how it shattered the world he had built around his father, a man who had been a distant figure in his life. Henry Carter's silence had been his defining trait, a silence that Ethan had accepted as a part of his father's nature. Now, with the knowledge of Lily, his secret daughter, everything had shifted. The silence was no longer just a part of his father, it was the manifestation of a family that had been kept hidden. A story never told. But even as Ethan wrestled with this newfound truth, there was something else that couldn't be ignored. A child had been left behind when his mother passed. A child who had grown up in the shadows of a secret that had never been revealed. Ethan felt a strange pull, a responsibility he hadn't expected. And when Lily passed away unexpectedly, it was as if the weight of the world had shifted again. But now, it was on his shoulders. Ethan had only met Lily a few times, and even those moments had been brief and awkward. He had barely known her. But when news of her sudden death reached him, something inside him snapped into focus. She had left behind a son. A boy named Noah. A boy who, despite the grief of losing his mother, still carried a brightness in his eyes. Ethan had promised himself, after everything that had happened with his father, that he wouldn't let another child grow up without the presence of family. It didn't take long for Ethan to decide that Noah would be his responsibility now. He couldn't undo the years of silence, but he could create a new narrative. It was a strange decision, one that felt as if it had come out of nowhere. But when he looked at Noah, he saw something familiar, something that spoke to him in a way he hadn't expected. This child had lost his mother. And now, Ethan realized, he had lost his father too. There were nights when the weight of it all felt too heavy. Noah was a quiet boy, but even in his silence, there was a longing for something, perhaps for stability, for comfort, or simply for answers that he would never receive. Ethan found himself trying to fill the voids that had been left in their lives. He tried his best to be patient with Noah, to provide a home, a sense of security, but the challenge was greater than he had anticipated. The first few days after Noah's mother died were a blur of logistical details, funeral arrangements, legal documents, and the awkward task of finding a place for Noah to stay. The grief was palpable, but there was also a feeling of uncertainty. Ethan had no idea what it meant to be a father. He had spent most of his life avoiding the idea of parenting, unsure of how to handle the responsibility. But there was no time for hesitation now. Noah needed him, whether he was ready or not. Ethan drove Noah to his new home, a place that, up until now, had only been his. The house felt different now. The walls that had once stood silent, filled with his own solitude, now echoed with the sounds of a child's laughter, the clatter of toys, and the steady rhythm of life that had been absent for so long. At first, Ethan didn't know how to interact with Noah. Should he make him feel at home? Or should he give him space? He didn't know the answers. But he tried his best to create a safe space for the boy. It wasn't perfect. The house was messy in ways it had never been before. The fridge was filled with juice boxes and snacks instead of bottles of wine. There were sticky fingerprints on the furniture, toys scattered across the floors, and forgotten shoes left by the door. But it felt right. It felt like home. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Ethan questioned his decision. Moments when the weight of his new responsibility felt like too much. But there were also moments of light, quiet mornings when Noah would ask him about the moon or the stars. Or the way his eyes would light up when they played soccer in the backyard. In those moments, Ethan found himself growing. He didn't have all the answers. And he didn't know how to fix everything. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let Noah go. He couldn't let him slip through the cracks. Not like his father had done with him. One night, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, Noah suddenly asked, "Do you think Mom can see us now?" Ethan hadn't been prepared for the question, but it cut through the noise of his mind. He looked down at Noah, who was watching him intently, his small face filled with hope. Ethan didn't have the answer. Not one that could ease the pain or make things right. But he knew what he had to do. "I think she sees everything," Ethan said quietly, "and I think she's proud of you." It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the start of a new chapter. One that neither of them had expected. But one that was filled with possibility. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were still questions, still moments of doubt, but there was something growing between them. Something real. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was building something that would last, a family. His family. As time passed, Ethan and Noah grew closer, their bond deepening in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Life was far from perfect, but it was theirs, raw, real, and filled with moments of laughter, joy, and quiet understanding. Ethan found himself doing things he never thought possible, planning school lunches, attending parent-teacher meetings, and even learning how to braid Noah's hair after a long day of work. It was messy, it was chaotic, but it was also beautiful in its simplicity. Noah, too, found his place in this new world, his once uncertain steps now steady, his voice growing louder with each passing day. He called Ethan, Dad, one morning, without fanfare, without hesitation, and in that simple, unspoken gesture, Ethan understood that this was the family they had built together. Not one born from the ties of blood, but from something stronger, love, trust, and the choice to be there for each other when it mattered most. Years passed, and as Ethan watched Noah grow, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had finally found his place, not just in the world, but in this new chapter of life. He wasn't the man he once was, closed off, distant, afraid of vulnerability. He was a father now, a role he had never imagined for himself but had come to cherish. And so, as they walked together into the future, Ethan realized that family wasn't defined by the past. It was something you built, something you chose, and in this second chance at life, they had found something truly remarkable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more heartfelt life stories. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.